Cowboy whispered to the widow. He'd trade 10 herds. Just for one fateful night. Before we begin, take a moment to share your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now find yourself a quiet place. Breathe deeply and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into this evening's tale. The hot wind swept across West Texas where the earth had cracked open like old leather, and the dry well gave off the hollow rasp of stone grating against stone. Margaret stood alone at its rim, her faded black dress stirring in the red dust. On her lips lingered the salt of tears that had run dry long before the water did. Far out on the horizon, the dust brightened into a thin streak, a lone rider on horseback drawing near his shadow, peeling itself away from the burning sky like a fragile promise. She tightened her grip on the empty bucket, her heart fractured like the fields beneath her feet. Tonight, in a desert of prejudice and hunger, could a stranger bring with him something rarer than water, a shelter for the heart, and be willing to trade 10 herds of cattle just for the chance to whisper once into the widow's ear? The wind howled through the broken fence, carrying the sting of scorched earth and red dust straight into the chest. On the Sullivan Ranch, once green with tender grass, only spiderweb cracks remained stretching all the way to the horizon. The cattle stood gaunt in the rare patches of shade, their ribs showing sharp beneath rough hide, their dull eyes waiting for the end. Margaret Sullivan, just 26, yet her face already carved with years of sorrow, stood at the rim of a dry well rope hanging limp in her hand, gazing into the hollow dark below. The water was nearly gone, as was her strength, as was her faith. Her black mourning dress had faded to gray, worn thin, like the grief she had carried through 8 long months since her husband's death beneath a fallen tree. Now she was mother and father keeper of the land and shield for her 4-year-old son. "Mama, the chickens are acting strange again." Samuel's voice trembled. The boy's gray eyes looked older than his years, as though he bore his mother's worries on his small shoulders. Margaret turned, forcing a smile, but his tiny hand clutched her sleeve until his knuckles blanched. A quiet flash of pity stirred, reminding us that out west children were never allowed to be only children. Across the fields, dust rose again. The man who came was no friend but Elijah Morse from the bank. His dark suit was damp with sweat, yet his eyes stayed cold as steel. 2 months left. "Widow," he said, voice sweet, but hiding a blade. The words struck like a hammer against a roof already rotting. Margaret's heart clenched, yet she straightened her back and answered with a hoarse defiance. "This land is my son's inheritance. I will not sell." The world around her fell silent, save for the wind twisting through the broken fence. A frail woman daring to stand against the bank, against a town of prejudice, against the desert itself. This was the beginning of her tale. And as the figure of a lone rider slowly emerged on the blood-red horizon, the listeners knew destiny was riding closer, carrying with it trials, dangers, and the fragile spark of hope. Part 1. The Stranger. Dusk fell over the ranch like a heavy curtain, turning red dust into a glow of burnished copper before sinking into deep indigo. The last rays of sunlight slanted across the porch, where Margaret Sullivan stood with a rifle resting close at hand. Her figure was slight, but her eyes held no weakness, only the fierce light of a mother's instinct to survive. From the horizon, a rider appeared. His horse limped with dried mud still clinging to its forelegs, sweat streaked white with salt. The man was tall in the saddle, his faded blue shirt worn thin. His red neckerchief frayed his wide brim hat, shadowing his face. He sat straight-backed, though every movement carried the weariness of long miles. When he halted at the gate, the saddle leather creaked. Margaret's grip tightened on the rifle, her finger brushing the trigger. Out here in the West, strangers brought more trouble than comfort. The man lifted his hat just enough to show a face dusted with the road, strong cheekbones, pale blue eyes like a winter sky carrying a deep fatigue. His voice was rough, low, like wind trapped between canyon walls. "Evening, ma'am. Name's Jake Ryland. My horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back. I was hoping I could borrow your tools, and maybe trade a bit of labor for a meal. Jerky only carries a man so far." Margaret didn't answer right away. In the fading light, Samuel clung to her skirts, gray eyes fixed on the stranger. Jake tipped his hat respectfully to the boy, and with that single gesture Samuel loosened his grip. A silence stretched as if the desert itself held its breath. At last Margaret inhaled deeply, her voice raspy from dust and too many quiet days. The forge is in the barn. Hasn't been used since before. Her words trailed off, but Jake only nodded, asking nothing more. He led his horse slowly, not threatening, but patient and respectful. In the dying light, his shadow and the horses blended into the red dust, leaving behind a woman still wary. Yet with a flicker in her chest, she had not allowed herself in months' hope. Inside the cool shade of the barn, Jake hung a lantern on a rusty hook. The trembling glow lit his sun-browned face, the small lines at the corners of his eyes marks of sleepless nights and lonely roads. He bent to the horse, rough hands steady and skilled, turning the hoof and checking each crack. The steady rhythm of hammer on iron rang out like a heartbeat, anchoring the dry silence. Margaret stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, watching every move. Jake said little, his focus steady. Yet in the way he patted the horse's neck, murmuring words too soft to catch, or wiped its sweat with his worn cloth, there was a gentleness rare among frontier men. For a moment, Margaret remembered the looks she got in town, prying, judgmental, or worse, hungry. But this stranger stepping into her yard made her feel less threatened than safe. When twilight deepened, Margaret laid supper on the small kitchen table, just beans and cornbread, yet the smell brought Samuel to sit upright, waiting. Jake entered, hat in hand, black hair damp from well water, his face younger without its road dust. He lingered at the threshold. "Ma'am, after weeks on the trail, beans and cornbread smell like heaven, but only if you'll have me at your table." Margaret blinked, surprised. How long had it been since a man had asked her permission with respect? She nodded slightly, motioning to the chair across. They ate quietly, the clink of spoons against bowls, the crackle of firewood in the stove. Samuel stared at Jake, then suddenly asked, "Did you fight in the war?" Margaret stiffened, about to hush him. But Jake set his spoon down, those pale eyes meeting the boy's. "I did, son, when I wasn't much older than your mama, and it's nothing I'm proud of." A heavy silence lingered. Samuel nodded as if grasping something beyond his years and whispered, "Papa died in the woods. A tree fell." Jake's hand tightened slightly, sorrow flashing across his face. "Then you're braver than most men I knew, because you're still here helping your mama." For the first time in weeks, Samuel smiled. Margaret felt her throat tighten. This stranger with just a few words had reached her son's heart, something she herself often failed to do. That night, Jake asked to sleep in the barn. He laid a thin blanket on the hay without complaint. From her window, Margaret saw him lying on his back, hand resting on his brow, eyes fixed on the timbered roof. He looked every bit a wanderer, carved by solitude, yet somehow his presence eased the emptiness of the night. The wind whistled through cracks, carrying the scent of hay, burnt iron, and the faint trace of coffee Jake carried in his pack. Margaret drew the curtain, admitting to herself what she had resisted. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel entirely alone. When Jake told Samuel, "You're braver than most men," I knew Margaret realized this was the first man who hadn't seen her son as pitiful, but as a small, courageous soul. It moved her to tears. Sleep came hard. The wind wailed like the land's own grief. From her rough bed, she heard the horse snort the shuffle of the stranger in the barn. She should have felt uneasy. Instead, the ranch seemed less hollow. She recalled Samuel's eyes at supper, lit for the first time since morning. She recalled the way Jake had set aside his hat, sat upright, and ate with the quiet dignity of one who valued every crumb. A stranger, yet carrying something rare in the harsh West respect. At dawn, Margaret stepped onto the porch. The eastern sky shone with a thin silver line. Out by the barn, Jake was already awake, crouched at the pump, splashing cold water on his face, droplets glimmering on his neck and shoulders. Scars lined faintly beneath his shirt like the etchings of a storm on stone, worn by weather, yet unbroken. "Morning, ma'am." He greeted, his voice rough but warm. Margaret nodded, flustered, a strange mix of caution and the yearning to trust. Samuel ran out holding a broken wooden toy horse. "Mr. Ryland?" Can you fix this?" His voice wavered with both shyness and hope. Jake turned the little horse in his hands. His eyes softened, and the first real smile touched his lips. "I reckon I can." It was just a wooden toy, but when Jake handed it back whole again, Samuel's eyes glowed as if the man had rebuilt the world itself. Margaret's hand gripped her apron, her chest tight with unspoken gratitude. That afternoon, Jake said quietly, "That roof of yours won't stand the next storm. If you'll allow me, I could mend it, in trade for supper." Margaret's eyes lifted to the sagging shingles. She knew the town would whisper if she let a stranger stay. But when the wind rattled the boards, she also knew she couldn't keep fighting alone. A rooster crowed somewhere off-key. Jake's gaze stayed steady, never pressing, leaving the choice to her. At last, Margaret nodded. Just for a few days. The evening sun fell across the porch. There stood a slender widow and a wandering cowboy, bound now by a fragile thread. Ahead lay storm's drought and the town's sharp judgment. But in this moment, there was only a trembling roof and two souls quietly choosing to let fate inside. When Jake mended the wooden horse for Samuel, Margaret stood still, eyes misted. And in that instant, she knew perhaps fate had brought this man not only to fix a toy, but to mend the broken pieces of her family. Part 2. The first days. The Texas sun rose fast, its harsh light pouring down as if to set the dry grasslands aflame. On Jake's first morning at the ranch, Margaret stood on the porch, eyes fixed on his every step. She was still wary, yet she couldn't deny it. In a single morning, that tall figure seemed to fold into the place as though he had always belonged. Jake began with the roof. He climbed up with nothing more than a rusty hammer and a few weathered boards salvaged from the old barn. The steady thunk-thunk of nails rang out, blending with the peeps of chicks below. Margaret looked up, her heart caught between unease and gratitude. Every stroke of his hammer seemed to strike at the empty burden she had carried alone for so long, a burden now just a little lighter. At the cattle pen, Jake worked through the dust without complaint. He rolled up his sleeves, the muscles in his sun-browned arms taut as he lifted heavy boards, mending a sagging fence. The gaunt cattle stood nearby, dull-eyed and weary, yet somehow steadier, with a calm man moving among them, his hand brushing along their backs before he set out feed. Samuel, who at first had hidden behind his mother's skirts, now trailed shyly after Jake's steps. He watched in silence until Jake turned, offering him the hammer with a smile. "Want to give me a hand, son?" Samuel's gray eyes lit up. He nodded, gripping the hammer that looked twice the size of his arm. Jake's rough hand guided his, adjusting his grip, like this, strong and steady. The boy's tiny swing was clumsy and weak, yet it made him laugh aloud, the first laughter to echo in that yard after months filled only with the morning wind. Margaret stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest. Her heart tightened, not with fear, but with a wordless swell of feeling. That sight, a man patiently showing her son how to hold a hammer, neither scolding nor dismissing, was something she thought she would never see again, not since Thomas died. By late afternoon, Jake sat with Samuel at the edge of the field mending rope while answering the boy's endless stream of questions: what horses ate, why the night sky carried so many stars, whether the rivers in Missouri were truly that wide. His answers came slow and steady, his deep voice dropping each word like a seed into young soil. Samuel leaned against his arm, eyes fluttering shut, and for the first time since his father's death, the boy drifted to sleep in another man's embrace. From a distance, Margaret watched her throat tight. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to believe she was no longer alone. But reason whispered back, this man was only passing through. Sooner or later, he would ride away, leaving a silence bigger than before. And yet, when night fell, Jake rose, gently lifting Samuel as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He carried the boy inside, laid him softly on the bed, and murmured, "Good night, boy," before retreating to the barn. On the porch, Margaret gripped her apron, watching his shadow fade into the dark. Her doubt had not vanished, but it had cracked, splintered by acts that asked for no reward. Through the wind sighing across the fence, Margaret whispered to herself, "Maybe, just maybe, The Texas sun burned hot from the very start, the only thin cloud whisked away, leaving a bare sky with no mercy. Margaret dragged the wooden bucket to the well, her heart sinking at the hollow echo rising from its depths. Only a few brackish pulls remained. Each drop now was worth more than gold. Jake came out from the barn shirt, clinging with sweat, a bucket of manure in his hand. His pale eyes flicked to the water in hers, and without a word, he reached for the rope. "Let me." He lowered the bucket, drew it up again, each motion slow and steady. When he set the water down on the porch, his gaze met hers, simple, honest. Not pity, but the quiet act of one sharing a burden. Margaret nodded her thanks, though a knot rose in her chest. How long had it been since anyone had shared her load? How long since every board mended, every pail lifted, every fence post set had not fallen only to her shoulders? By noon, in the blistering sun, Jake worked the north fence. He hauled away rotting planks and replaced them with whatever sound wood he could salvage from the old barn. His calloused hands tightened on the hammer, every strike echoing like a steady heartbeat. Samuel scurried about, gathering dropped nails, face streaked with dust, but eyes alight. "Good job, partner," Jake praised, ruffling the boy's tangle of blonde hair. Samuel laughed, the sound filling the yard that for months had known only dry wind and cattle's weary lowing. From a distance, Margaret paused with a basket of laundry in her arms. Sunlight blazed across Jake's damp back, his strong arms lifting each post into place. The sight was both strange and familiar, like a ghost of the man she thought forever gone. She turned away, but her chest stirred with a tremor she could not still. By evening, when the air softened, Jake sat on the porch, splitting wood. Samuel perched beside him with a wooden knife mimicking each move. Jake's voice was patient, low. "Keep your wrist steady. Let the tool do the work." Plain words, but spoken as if he'd been teaching children all his life. Margaret lingered at the doorway, listening. The scent of fresh-cut pine drifted into the warm smell of beans on the stove. The moment stirred memories of her own childhood back east, her father splitting wood, telling tales of far journeys. The memory stung her eyes with longing. That night at supper, Jake told Samuel a story of a wild horse that once carried him out of the hands of thieves. His voice was rough, never boastful, yet every detail vivid enough to set the boy's eyes dancing. Margaret sat in silence, letting the rumble of Jake's story and the clear laughter of her son weave together like a rare lullaby in that old house. When night deepened, the desert wind rose again, hot and restless. Jake spread his blanket on the hay in the barn, but when Margaret peered through the crack, he was still, upright eyes lifted to the stars. The Texas sky stretched endless, 1,000 points of light spilling over a solitary figure. From his pocket, he drew a scrap of wood, carving careful strokes in the flicker of a lantern. When Samuel ran over with his broken toy horse, Jake placed something new into his hands, a small wooden hawk, plain but solid. "Every cowboy needs a guardian," he said, smiling faintly. Samuel clutched the gift, eyes bright with wonder. Margaret stood still on the porch, her hand tight on the doorframe. In that moment, her doubt cracked once more. This stranger was not only mending roofs and fences, he was mending the hollow places in two weary hearts. The picture of Jake handing Samuel the wooden hawk, the boy's eyes alight, lingered with Margaret long into the night. A small moment yet, like a lantern flame, it drove back years of widow's dark. By the third morning, gray clouds gathered, and the wind blew harder than usual. Margaret rose early, hurrying to check the new porch roof, her chest tight with worry. But when she looked up, she saw the boards fastened firm, not a gap in sight. Jake stood steady on the roof, his shirt flapping in the wind, his manner calm as though this had been his work all his life. "Storm won't trouble this roof anymore," he called down, his voice certain. Margaret nodded, answering softly, "Thank you." Two simple words, yet for her harder to speak than hauling water from the dry well. Samuel raced across the yard with the wooden hawk clutched in his hand, his laughter carrying clear across the brittle fields. Jake watched the corners of his mouth lifting faintly before he turned back to his task. That afternoon, Margaret set an old coat, her husband's, by the barn door. "Nights are cold," she said, her eyes refusing to meet his. Jake's hand lingered on the faded cloth, his fingers brushing a frayed seam. He knew at once it was more than a coat. It was a memory of another man, a past he could never replace. He gave a quiet nod, his voice low. "I'll take good care of it." In that moment, Margaret felt another crack run through her wall of doubt. This man did not push, did not try to erase. He stepped in like a shadow beside her, honoring even the losses she still carried. That night, the sky loosed a few drops of rain, the first in long months of drought. Not enough to ease the land, but enough for Margaret to open the window and breathe deeply. In the dark, she heard Jake moving through the barn, his voice low and steady as he soothed the horses. The rain tapped gentle on the new roof, solid and sure. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, realizing her heartbeat had changed. It was no longer only tension or vigilance. Something softer stirred like water, seeping back beneath cracked earth. She whispered, barely more than breath, "Maybe this land isn't the only thing worth saving." The sight of Margaret laying Thomas's old coat for Jake and Jake answering with respect was a small act, yet enough to stir the widow's heart. For the first time, she felt she could share the weight without betraying the past. Part 3. Facing Judgment. That morning before the sun climbed high, the sound of hooves broke the silence. It was not the steady rhythm of a lone traveler, but a whole group pounding hard against the dry earth. Margaret was sweeping the porch when her heart sank. It had been months since townsfolk rode straight into her yard, and experience had taught her no good ever followed. Through the red haze of dust, 3 riders emerged. Bob Hutchkins, broad as a boulder, his face flushed with whiskey. Carl Meyer, thin as a rail, his sharp chin like a vulture's beak. And Reverend Williams, his black coat billowing, his expression straining for piety. They reined in at the gate without a single polite nod. Their eyes said enough they had come to judge, not to visit. Margaret set her broom aside, her back straight, though her knuckles whitened around the handle. For a moment, memories surged, those first Sundays after Thomas's death. Women whispering in church, "So young she'll remarry soon enough." Men staring openly as if widowhood meant invitation. That shame rose fresh again, now standing bold on her own porch. Hutchkins growled, "Widow Sullivan word is you've got a stranger in your barn, eating at your table, working your land. Folks in town are talking plenty." His voice struck like a hammer, and Samuel, playing inside with his wooden hawk, startled. Margaret drew a long breath. To retreat would be to admit. So she lifted her chin. He fixed the roof, patched the fence. In return for supper, nothing more. Carl Meyer's eyes narrowed, his smile sour. A young widow alone with a child, letting some drifter sleep under her roof. People are bound to wonder. The words cut sharp. Margaret's face burned hot, yet she stood her ground. People wonder plenty. But when my roof leaked, when my hens died of thirst, did any of you come help? People wondered and then turned away. Reverend Williams stepped forward, voice wrapped in false kindness, heavy as a verdict. "We care for your soul, Margaret. A woman of honor must guard her image. Your son needs an example." A gust of wind swept the yard, carrying the scent of dung and parched dust. Margaret swallowed hard, throat too tight to shout what she longed to, that honor didn't mend roofs, that honor didn't feed a child. But their cold stares strangled her words. Then came the sound of boots on gravel. Jake Ryland appeared, hammer still in hand, sleeves rolled, his sun-darkened arms streaked with dust. He didn't rush. He simply mounted the steps, standing taller than the 3 riders. His pale eyes swept over each face, not with threat, but with a calm weight that pressed the air tight. "Morning, gentlemen," his voice low and rough, yet steady. "The roof's tight, the fence is standing, and that boy," he nodded toward Samuel, trembling behind the curtain, "has supper tonight. If you came to lend a hand, be welcome. If not, then business here is finished." The air grew heavy. Hutchkins shifted in his saddle fingers, working the reins. Carl Meyer looked away. The Reverend cleared his throat, trying to recover. "We only want what's best for her welfare." Jake tipped his hat, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Then the best you can do is let a widow tend her life without a whole posse riding up to her porch to pass judgment." From inside, Samuel yanked the curtain wide, his gray eyes meeting theirs. His voice was small, yet it rang clear. "Mama doesn't need saving. We're fine. The words fell like a stone into a still pond. Hutchkins glared, then turned his horse. Carl muttered under his breath. The Reverend coughed, avoiding his own reflection. They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising behind them. When the sound of hooves faded, only the wind remained, and the pounding of Margaret's heart. Jake set the hammer down, his tone gentler. If my being here causes trouble, I can move on. The honesty was so plain it seemed he might mount and ride that instant. Margaret's answer leapt quicker than thought. No, let them talk. Roof still leaks, fence still breaks. Work's not done. Their eyes met. It was more than work, they acknowledged. It was an unspoken bond. She was no longer standing alone against the town. Samuel peeked out, clutching the wooden hawk, a small smile on his face. The sight filled Margaret's eyes with tears, not of weakness, but of a relief she had not felt in so long. That afternoon she sat on the porch steps, her hand resting on the spot where Jake had left the hammer. The breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh-cut timber, washing away the bitterness. She looked toward the barn where Jake still worked, tall and steady, as if those men had never come at all. Later, with Samuel asleep, Margaret faced her own reflection in the dim old mirror. A thin face, hair, loose eyes, weary. But beyond her shoulder, through the window, she saw the lantern glow in the barn. Jake sat there sharpening an axe, his frame upright, calm. The rasp of steel on stone echoed steady like the heartbeat of a home. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest and whispered just for herself, "Maybe I'm not alone anymore." The image lingered. Margaret's reflection of loneliness broken, and behind her the quiet presence of a cowboy who had stood before her porch and without a fight returned to her what the town had tried to steal, her right to hold honor, and the belief that even a widow's dignity was worth defending. Part 4. Driving the herd to Clear Creek. At dawn, the sky was only a thin rim of purple gray. The air hung heavy with the heat left from yesterday, promising another merciless day ahead. Margaret tightened the girth on Old Bess, while Jake checked each waterskin, his hands moving across every knot of rope, as if one small mistake might cost them the whole drive. The herd stood spotted and gaunt, breathing rough hooves scraping against the baked ground. Margaret stroked the oldest cow, feeling the bones jutting sharp beneath the hide. Her heart ached. If they didn't find water, the herd would fall before autumn ended. And with it, the ranch Samuel's future. Everything. 2 days' drive. Jake said, his voice rough but steady. Through Carson's Gulch. Hard land, but if we move steady, they'll make it. Margaret looked at him, worry flashing in her eyes. And if they don't? He drew the reins, tight pale eyes catching the new light. Then we try anyway. Better to fight for water than wait here to die of dust. The simple words cut through the gloom like a blade. Margaret nodded. She was long used to hard choices. They set out as the sun edged over the horizon. The crack of a whip, the weak bellow of cattle, the pounding of hooves, all mingled with red dust rising in the morning air. Samuel had been left with the Johanssons. He had cried when torn from his mother's arms. Margaret bent low, whispering into his hair, "Mama will always come back." The words clung to her heart like an oath. The cattle trudged slow, every step heavy. Dust clung to skin hair and parched throats. By midday, the sun blazed down, scorching even the last scraps of hope. Sweat ran down Margaret's face, her shirt plastered to her back. She shouted herself hoarse, driving the herd forward, her heart racing with fear. Beside her rode Jake, tall and steady as a landmark on the open plain. At times, he whistled sharp and short, and the herd that threatened to scatter pulled back into line. Every move of his carried a calm that steadied her own. She thought fleetingly, had she been alone, she would have collapsed within the first hour. That night, they stopped in a narrow gulch where thin grass pushed between the rocks. Jake built a fire, its glow flickering across his sun-worn face, deep with fatigue. Margaret tended Bess, whispering to the old mare like a lifelong friend. The fire cracked, insects droned, and beyond lay the vast silence of the desert night. They sat opposite the flames, coffee bitter in tin cups. Jake stared into the fire, his voice low. "You handle those cattle like you were born to it." Margaret's smile was faint, tired, but proud. "My father raised beef in Tennessee. I could rope and ride before I could read. Thomas never liked that part of me. Said it wasn't fitting for a woman. Jake looked up firelight in his pale eyes, his tone grave. Then Thomas was a fool. You kept his legacy alive when he couldn't. That's worth more than all the needlepoint in the world. Margaret fell silent, but her heart shook. His words echoed through her, even when the canyon wind made her shiver deep into the night. The second day was harder still. The sun blazed, the wind-scorched dust devils whipped across the trail, scattering the herd. Margaret's voice rasped from shouting while Jake circled wide, cracking his whip to drive them back on course. A calf stumbled, legs buckling. Margaret leapt down, cradling it, tears brimming at its frail body, trembling. Jake spurred close, swung down, and with raw strength lifted the calf upright. "Not today," he muttered, setting it on its feet. The calf trembled, then tottered on, rejoining the herd. Margaret watched, choked with feeling. A drifting cowboy, but one who gave all his strength to cradle life itself. That evening, the sun bled red along the horizon. The herd staggered on. Then a sound broke the air, a trickle faint like the earth whispering. Margaret froze, heart pounding. Jake heard it too. His eyes lit sharp. Clear Creek, he breathed. Margaret pressed Bess forward, straining to see. And then, like a miracle, a line of green rose ahead, trees shimmering in sunset along the stream. The herd caught the scent, bellowed loud, and surged forward with their last strength. Margaret cried out, half laugh, half sob. Jake rode beside her, whistling sharp, guiding them on. The herd plunged into the shallow creek, plunging muzzles deep, splashing water like a chorus of salvation. Margaret collapsed to her knees in the grass, tears falling as her hands dipped into the cool stream. Jake swung down, came beside her, his rough hand resting on her shoulder, warm and sure. "We made it," he said, voice husky yet full of faith. Margaret looked up, eyes shining with water and firelight. And in that moment, amid desert dust and the song of Clear Creek, the sound was not only water, it was the sound of hope, fragile but so true that a widow's heart could believe at last tomorrow might be different. As the gaunt herd drank deep from Clear Creek, Margaret knelt on the bank, tears mingling with the rushing stream. Jake's hand pressed firm on her shoulder, his words, "We made it," sealing the moment. For the first time in many months, she believed there was a future still waiting. Part 5. Carver's ambush night settled over Clear Creek, a velvet sky pinned with cold stars. After drinking their fill, the cattle lay scattered along the bank, their heavy breathing turning into a slow, burdened rhythm. Margaret sat by a small fire, both hands wrapped around a warm tin cup, eyes fixed on the wavering flames. The light lifted a soft glow onto her face, and the depths of her eyes caught and held the flicker. Across from her, Jake honed his knife. Each stroke rang crisp against the whetstone's steady spare like the heartbeat of the camp. He spoke little now and then, glancing toward the herd, then into the reach of the dark. Margaret felt the tension threaded through his stillness. Beneath insect drone and cattle breath lay something else, a silence too perfect. No wind, no night bird. The land seemed to hold its breath. Jake set the knife down, voice low and rough. "Something's off." Before she could ask, she caught the faint scrape of hooves beyond the ring of light. Her heart clenched. A harsh laugh ripped the dark. "Ryland, been a while." 3 riders slid out of the black firelight, winking on metal. At their head was Bill Carver, lean, angular eyes, narrow and bright as a predator's. 2 younger men flanked him, their looks hard and eager. Margaret rose, hand finding the rifle by the blanket. Jake turned in a smooth motion, thumb settling near his holster. Carver's lip curled, showing yellowed teeth. "Pretty widow you've got there, Ryland. Dragging her and a herd of walking skeletons through the desert. Thought you had better taste." Jake didn't answer. He stepped once, placing himself between Carver and Margaret. Firelight threw his shadow long and steady across the ground, solid as a wall. "Turn back, Carver," he said, level as a plumb line. "We want no trouble." Carver barked a laugh. "No trouble. You think I rode out for a friendly chat? Those cattle may be bones, but bones fetch coin. And the lady," his gaze slid over Margaret, making her skin go cold, Fetches more. His gun came up fast, but Jake was faster. A shot-cracked light flared, and Carver's hat blew open with a neat hole dead center. He froze, then howled. "Damn you, Ryland." Both henchmen fired. A bullet hissed past Margaret's ear and buried in a tree. She hit the dirt heart-pounding breath, steadying as her hands worked the rifle. She squeezed the trigger. One man reeled, clutching a bleeding arm, and slumped on his saddle. Jake moved forward, gun answering. The second rider fell back, shooting wild. A round clawed the dust at Margaret's boots. Fire snapped powder, stung the air. The herd bawled in panic. The night shuddered with the rough music of life and death. Carver cursed and circled, his shape flashing in and out of the glow. Jake leaned, fired again. Carver jerked a line of red, staining his shoulder. He only grinned, eyes gone wild. Behind a fallen log, Margaret reloaded. Her hands shook, but Thomas's old lesson whispered back, "Steady your breath. Aim true." She drew a slow inhale, sighted the gap, and fired. Carver jerked the reins hard. His horse screamed and spun away. It felt endless, but the fight lasted only minutes. From the dark came a ragged cry. The last henchman toppled from his saddle and lay still. Carver wheeled, blood slicking his sleeve, his glare poisoned with promise. "This ain't over, Ryland, nor you, widow." He spurred into the black, leaving dust and the bitter tang of smoke. Silence crept back. The cattle's frantic bawling ebbed. Firelight jumped over Margaret's smoke-smudged face. Her rifle sagged in her arms, then Jake's hands settled warm and firm on her shoulders. "You all right?" His eyes searched her quickly. "I'm fine," she gasped. "You?" He gave a crooked smile, still breathing. "That's enough." Tears broke loose, not from pain, but from the nearness of death, from the fact that this man, still almost a stranger, had stepped between her and the dark, as if her life outranked his. Jake drew her in. His heartbeat thudded against her cheek until hers matched it. Gun smoke, sweat dust, everything folded into one truth: they had survived because they stood together. When his arms closed around her in the dying glow, Margaret trembled but felt his strong pulse steady in her ear, the pulse of a man who had chosen their side at the edge of the night. After Carver vanished, the sky went terribly still. The fire hissed softly. Cattle and horses blew hard. Margaret's fingers locked so tight on the stock that her knuckles blanched. Jake eased the rifle from her hands and set it down. "Easy. It's over for now." Her eyes were red when she looked up. "He'll come back. Men like him don't run forever." Jake didn't deny it. He studied the darkness where Carver had gone, steel in his pale gaze. "Yes, he will, and we'll be ready." He rose to check the camp. Margaret followed Pulse, still wild eyes combing the shadows. They circled the herd-counted heads. Many still milled and bawled, but none were hurt. For the first time that night, relief cracked her chest and spilled out as a broken sob. Jake turned at once, a calloused palm warm against her cheek. "You were brave. Damn brave, Margaret Sullivan." The words opened a flood. Months of holding fast to land, to child, to pride poured out at once. Jake gathered her close and let her lean his hands slow and sure against her back. Firelight cast their joined shadows long across the dust. In that moment, the beat beneath her ear was not just survival, it was a vow kept in the body of a man who chose to stand in front of her when it mattered. When their cartridges were checked and the fire fed, Jake said, "We take turns on watch. He won't likely try again tonight, but I'm not gambling on luck." Margaret nodded, wiping her face on her sleeve. She sat by the flames, rifle within reach, eyes on the dark. Jake sat near, knife in hand, the light hardening his features to granite. Silence settled, only the soft pop of sap in the wood. Margaret looked down at her hands, still trembling. The moment of the shot flickered in her mind, Carver flinching, the horse's shriek, the sting of smoke. For the first time in her life, she had fired to kill. Jake saw the far look in her eyes. "Don't carry it too heavy," he said gently. "You did what you had to." Her voice rasped. "I was terrified, but if I hadn't, he would have. You protected yourself." He cut in, calm and sure. "And me. There's no shame in that." The words were simple, hammered true. Her chest eased. She looked at him, the fire's reflection softening the ice of vigilance in his eyes until warmth showed through. Wind freshened toward midnight. Margaret pulled a blanket around her shoulders. Jake kept his watch gaze pinned to the dark. At last, she whispered, "Jake, what if he comes back with more men?" He didn't turn, but his answer came steady as a beam. "Then we'll fight again. And if I fall, you keep fighting. Because this land, this herd, your boy, they're worth every bullet." She bit her lip, vision blurring. The truth she had kept hidden slipped free. "I'm so tired of fighting alone." This time he looked at her, quiet, filling the space between them. "Then don't," he said softly. "Not anymore." In his eyes, she saw no empty promise, only a plain, solid truth. A road-worn drifter had chosen to stay knowing the enemy would return. That presence, more than guns or walls, was the strong point she thought she would never have again. She nodded once. No more words. She let her head rest on his shoulder, the song of fire and wind carrying them through what remained of the night. In the darkness after the gunfight, Margaret whispered, "I'm so tired of fighting alone." Jake answered, "Then don't. Not anymore." It was more than survival. It was the beginning of shared burden, a quiet vow between them. Part 6. The Storm and the Confession. That afternoon, the Texas sky turned suddenly the color of bruised violet. Black clouds rolled up from the horizon and swallowed the last of the gold light in a breath. The air grew heavy as lead. Wind slammed the little cabin until its timbers shuddered. Margaret dropped the window latch. Her hands trembled at the far-off growl of thunder. Jake came in from penning the herd shirt, dark with sweat. He set his hat on the table, eyes on the roiling sky. "Storm's coming. A bad one." Margaret nodded. Wind hissed through the wall seams, and the house shook. She remembered the last gale that tore the roof loose, how she'd sheltered Samuel alone. But the thought of not facing the storm by herself eased something tight in her chest. Rain fell as if the sky had split. It hammered the patched tin roof, drowning every other sound. Lightning flashed, bleaching the room bright for a heartbeat, then casting it back into shadow. The cabin quivered. Window frames groaned. Samuel slept in the corner, wrapped in a blanket worn out from the trail. Margaret and Jake sat across from each other by the wavering lantern. They said nothing. Only rain and thunder spoke. A white blaze lit Jake's face. He was watching her, the pale of his eyes holding both firelight and stormlight. Margaret's heart stumbled. In that look was more than vigilance, something deeper, long kept. At last he spoke, voice rough as if pulled through a thicket of years. "Margaret, I need you to know. I've been running for years, running from memories from myself. But the day I stepped into your yard, I stopped running." She didn't move. Her fingers curled on the chair rail. Thunder cracked. The cabin lurched. Jake's words landed harder than the weather. He stood, took one step toward her, then halted as if afraid of his own feet. "I'd trade 10 herds, 10 years, everything I've got, for just one night inside your heart." The confession fell and vanished into the pounding rain. Margaret couldn't breathe. Loneliness, months of bracing nights of wind and no answer. All of it broke loose at once. She rose, closed the space. "Jake." Her voice shook. "I've tried to be strong, proper, to live like a widow should. But I'm 26 and I'm so tired of being alone." He searched her face, hand lifting and hesitating. "If we cross this line, there's no going back." She drew a steady breath and nodded. "Then let's not go back." Thunder crashed as if the world split. Jake's arms found her. Their mouths met, tentative, then sure breath mingling the salt of tears with the bitter trace of coffee on his lips. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, warmth rose until nothing else remained. They broke for air, foreheads touching, breath unsteady. "Woman," he whispered hoarse, "you'll be the death of me." Margaret laughed through tears. "I hope not. I've buried one man already." They both laughed, light relieved like rain washing dust from stone. The lantern guttered. The cabin shivered. But for the first time in months, Margaret felt no fear. In the ring of Jake's steady arms, she knew she would not have to weather this alone. The line, "I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside your heart," and the kiss in the storm were the crest of it all, a softening of old solitude, the tempest made witness to a love just born. The cabin still rattled under sheets of rain, yet the small fire in the stove threw a circle of warmth. After the kiss, they settled near it, breathing still rough. Margaret pulled a blanket around her shoulders, though her heart burned bright enough to forget the cold. Jake set his gun within reach and stirred the coals. Sparks rose and faded. Firelight carved and shaded his face, strong and tired, and for the first time she saw not only his grit, but the deep sorrow beneath it. Silence held for a while, only storm and the quiet pop of sap in the wood. Then Jake spoke, voice drawn from the deepest part of him. 5 years ago, I had a wife, Emily. Fever took her while I was out on a drive. By the time I came back, it was too late. Margaret turned and slid her hand to his. He didn't pull away. Her small squeeze brought a flicker of light to his eyes. I know what it is to lose the one you love, she whispered. I saw Thomas under that fallen tree, and from that day I thought my heart was buried with him. Wind howled as if to drown them out, but speaking the hurt became its own shelter. I ran, Jake said. Kansas to Texas, then New Mexico, Nevada. Kept moving. Thought if I wore my boots thin enough the memories would loosen, but they didn't. Every night I saw Emily. Margaret held his gaze and found only truth. I wanted to run too. Pack up, take Samuel back east to my sister. But I knew if I did, I'd lose this land for good. It's Thomas's and it's my boys. They sat quiet while the stove murmured like something listening. Lightning split the dark, etching Margaret's face clear. Jake saw pain there and a stubborn light that did not burn out. You're stronger than you know, Margaret Sullivan, he said softly. Her throat closed. Tears came not from despair but release. She laid her brow to his shoulder. And maybe, I don't have to be strong alone anymore. Jake's arms wrapped her gentle in a way few would expect from a trail-worn cowboy. His rough hand traced slow along her back, steady as if smoothing away the layers of strain. The storm kept shouting, but inside by the fire they set down their grief and found a new harbor in each other. No fine vows, no grand promises, just warmth and the hold of two hands. Margaret let herself lean into him, and for the first time in 8 months, sleep came without the weight of ghosts, carried by a man who had told her the truest, strangest thing she'd ever heard. I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside your heart. After the kiss by the fire, they spoke their losses for the first time, wife and husband gone, and Margaret discovered the tenderness under Jake's hard edge. She let herself rest there, and loneliness finally loosened its hold. Part 7. The barn in flames. That night the wind shifted. The storm had passed, but the sky hung low and heavy, cloaked in an iron lid of cloud. The darkness was thick, pressing down on the cabin, pressing down on the land. Margaret tossed restlessly in her bed, the air inside close and still. In the corner, Samuel slept curled in his small blanket, his breathing faint and uneven after the long, weary days on the trail. At first it was only a scent, sharp, bitter, out of place. Margaret stirred, blinking in the dark. For a heartbeat she thought it was the stove, a coal left smoldering, but then came the sound, high, shrill, tearing through the night, the scream of horses, panicked, choking the air. Her heart clenched. She shot upright, bare feet on the wooden floor and rushed for the door. The moment she pulled it open, the world erupted. Flames had already taken hold of the barn. Sheets of fire clawed into the sky, red and orange, licking the night like the tongue of some great beast. Smoke boiled upward, rolling black and choking. The acrid smell of burning timber and singed hair stung her eyes, seared her throat until each breath was ragged fire. Fire. Her cry broke sharp against the wind. From inside, Samuel woke with a sob, clutching his blanket tight. "Mama, stay inside," she commanded, her voice breaking, and she was gone, running headlong into the blaze. The barn shuddered with each crack of timber. The sound of splitting beams cracked like gunshots, mingling with the bawling of cattle and the screams of horses. Margaret seized a quilt, soaked it hastily, and dragged it over her head before plunging into the suffocating haze. Through the wall of smoke she found Bess, old faithful Bess, wild-eyed hooves thrashing the stall. The mare's nostrils flared, white foam streaking her mouth as she struck the boards. Other cows rolled their eyes in terror, their cries sharp as blades. Margaret flung the wet quilt over the mare's head, whispering soothing nonsense through her coughs, and fought with the iron latch. The heat blasted her face. Her palms blistered with every touch. She clenched her teeth, yanked hard, and the gate sprang free. Bess lunged forward, bursting out so fiercely she nearly knocked Margaret to the ground. The mare vanished into the smoky night. Margaret stumbled, coughing, eyes watering, lungs raw, yet turned again, reaching for the next stall. A beam above her groaned and split with a deafening crash. Sparks and embers cascaded, hot stings peppering her arms. The blow hurled her down into the straw, now smoldering beneath her. Heat pressed against her chest. Breath refused to come. Her vision swam the world, narrowing to choking smoke and the searing sting of ash. In that instant, she saw death, saw it as she had on the day Thomas fell beneath the tree, helpless, crushed, gone. Cold dread swept her even in the furnace of fire. And then hands, strong, sure, pulling her upright. Jake, damn fool woman. His voice was hoarse, ragged, half fury, half fear. He wrapped his arm tight around her waist, lifted her as if she were nothing, and surged through the fire. They burst into the open night where the cold wind struck like a blessing. Margaret collapsed to her knees in the dirt, hacking her lungs, fighting for air, her vision a blur of light and shadow. Jake dropped beside her, his own face smeared, black eyes blazing pale in the firelight. "Margaret, look at me. Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her chest still seizing for breath. "The horses? The cattle?" Jake gripped her shoulders, his eyes fierce, reflecting the blaze. "To hell with the horses. You could have died in there." Her throat burned. She wanted to protest, but only a whisper escaped. "I couldn't lose them too." Jake crushed her against him, heart pounding so hard she could hear it. His words ground out low, almost desperate. "Don't you ever do that again. Don't you dare." And still through the smoke, they fought. Together they dragged what animals they could, cutting ropes, driving beasts, stumbling into the yard. But most of the barn gave way, timbers falling in showers of sparks. The fire roared until nothing was left to claim. When dawn came, smoke still curled black into the sky. The ruins smoldered, skeletal beams collapsed inward. Several cattle lay still at the edge, their hides charred, the stench of death curling through the air, until Margaret's stomach twisted. She stood unsteady, hair tangled, face streaked black, her dress scorched and torn. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, from grief. Jake strode toward her, his shirt burned through in places, his forearms raw with blistered skin. In his hand he carried the twisted remains of a kerosene can, its edges warped by flame. Kerosene. His voice was a growl, deep and furious. This wasn't an accident. Carver. Margaret stared at the can, then at the ruin. The world tilted, her knees weak. She sank to the porch step, buried her face in her hands, and sobbed. "We've lost too much. The cattle, the barn. How can we keep fighting?" Jake dropped to his knees in front of her. His rough palms lifted her tear-streaked face, soot smudging his fingers as his thumbs brushed the wet from her cheeks. His voice was ragged with smoke, but iron threaded through it. "Because you're the strongest woman I've ever known, and you're not alone anymore. We'll fight. Together." Samuel rushed out, latching onto his mother's legs, eyes red from fear and smoke. Jake looked down at him and his voice softened. His hand came to rest on the boy's shoulder, steady and sure. "Don't worry, son. Your mama's stuck with me now." Margaret lifted her gaze, weary eyes rimmed with ash, yet somewhere within a faint spark glowed. She leaned her head against Jake's shoulder, too tired to argue, letting his arm bear the weight of her grief. The fire had taken the barn, the herd, a piece of their livelihood. But in that night of terror, Jake had carried her from the jaws of death and bound his fight to hers. The memory burned into her soul, Jake lifting her from the inferno, cursing, desperate, holding her as though she were the most precious thing he'd ever carried. Out of tragedy, a new strength was forged, not hers alone, but theirs together. Part 8. When the community stood beside them. The morning after the third night, the yard still smoldered. Ash glowed faintly in the corners of the ruin, and the bitter tang of smoke clung to every charred beam. Margaret sat slumped on the porch step, her blistered hands covering her face, her heart as hollow as the barn that no longer stood. Samuel sat small in her lap, unusually quiet, his round eyes staring at the heap of blackened timber, as if trying to understand how the home of the horses and the calves could vanish in a single night. Then came the soft sound of hooves on the dusty road. A gentle knock at the door broke the silence. Margaret, startled, rose and opened it. Standing there was Henrik Johansson. The old Swedish farmer stooped and silver-bearded, his eyes still bright with resolve. He removed his hat with slow dignity, held out a small, worn leather pouch, his hands trembling with age. His voice was slow, deliberate. "Margaret, years ago when Anna was giving birth, you sat with her 3 nights through when the twins cried without end. You never asked for a cent. Now it is our turn to repay." Margaret stared at the pouch, shook her head, her voice breaking. "Henrik, I can't. You struggle too. I cannot take it." But Henrik pressed it into her hands, his gaze kind yet unyielding. "This isn't charity. It's a loan. Pay it when you can. No interest. Out here we survive because we hold each other up. If men like Dalton or Carver take your land, it won't just be you who loses, it'll be all of us." Tears welled hot and unstoppable, spilling down onto Henrik's calloused hand. Samuel leaned forward suddenly, wrapping his small arms around the old man's leg, as if he understood that Henrik had brought them a miracle from the ashes. Before Margaret could close the door, another figure appeared. Mary Patterson, the widow from across the valley. She rode her tired gray horse, her black dress whipping in the wind. Across her saddle lay a basket heavy with dried fruit and salted meat. She dismounted without ceremony, went straight to Margaret and held her tight. Then she set the basket on the table and said, her voice breaking, "Last year when my husband broke his leg, you brought medicine. You nursed him a week straight. I never repaid. Today I do." Samuel darted to the basket, eyes wide. He pulled out a strip of dried meat and burst into delighted laughter. The sound rang bright through the dim cabin, and Margaret's tears flowed anew, not from grief, but from the joy of hearing her child laugh freely again. Word spread faster than the wind. Soon, neighbors came one after another. A young family brought a small sack of flour. The man scratched his head, embarrassed. "When my wife was in labor, you ran through the rain to fetch the doctor. I owed you." Margaret took the sack, trembling. Then came an old woman on a cane, leaving a few potatoes at the porch. "Not much, but it is what I have." Margaret knelt, clutching the woman's shoulders, sobbing openly. A boy and his father arrived with an armful of firewood, reminding her of the winter she had given them milk when their pantry ran dry. Each story, each offering like small embers cast onto a dying fire, rekindled the warmth inside her chest. Samuel ran about the yard, clutching a biscuit in one hand, laughing with his mouth full, his little feet carrying him from one neighbor to the next, as though to greet each hand extended toward them. The once empty cabin filled with humble gifts, coins jingling in cloth pouches, a handful of corn seed jars of preserved strips of lard. Nothing grand, nothing enough to make them rich yet. To Margaret they shone brighter than gold. Each gift was proof she had never truly been abandoned. By late afternoon, neighbors drifted home, leaving the kitchen rich with the scent of biscuits and salt pork. Margaret sank to the floor, Samuel in her arms gazing at the pile of simple offerings. Her eyes blurred, not with sorrow but with a light she thought long lost, the light of kindness. Night fell. The oil lamp flickered shadows dancing across the worn wood walls. On the cramped kitchen table lay the little treasures, the coins, the small sacks, jars, and firewood stacked together. A fragile hoard, yet one that made the cabin glow with warmth. Margaret sat by the table, her fingers trembling as she counted each coin, tears sliding down her cheeks. Samuel sat in her lap, his young voice chirping as he counted along, giggling as if it were the finest game in the world. His gray eyes sparkled with innocent joy, a sound and sight the house had not known in far too long. Margaret's heart cracked open. The weariness and shame of so many months seemed washed away by that laughter. Jake sat across the table, quietly stacking the coins into neat piles. His pale eyes were intent, but now and then he looked up, meeting hers, with a gaze both gentle and firm. His voice came rough, low, steady, almost enough for the bank payment. Margaret froze, clutching the coins tighter, as if they might vanish. "Still short, aren't we?" she whispered, eyes blurring again. Jake did not answer at once. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the pay from his last cattle drive, worn bills creased but solid. He laid them on the table. The soft slap of paper against wood rang out like a pledge. "This makes it enough." Margaret stared, throat tight. "Jake, no. That's your labor, your wages. I can't take." He cut her off, his eyes catching the lamplight, fierce and unwavering. "Nothing I have is mine anymore. It's ours, if you'll have me." The room stilled. Only the wind sighed through the cracks, and the lamp hissed as the flame sputtered. Samuel looked from one to the other, wide-eyed, then burst out, "So Jake can stay. Forever." Margaret clutched her son, tears streaming again, but this time they were tears of release. She nodded, shaky but sure. Forever. Jake reached across the table, his rough hand closing over hers, holding firm. In that moment, among the scattered coins, the lingering smell of smoke, and the fragile lamplight, a family was born, not through gold or land, but through sharing, through trust, through choosing to stand together when the world had nearly fallen apart. Part 9. The Trial for Life and Land. The morning of the trial broke cold and dry over Cedar Ridge. The air was sharp, the kind that carried dust and rumors alike. Wind swept down the road, whistling along the clapboard houses, rattling loose shutters as it led the townsfolk toward the courthouse. Margaret, dressed in the plainest garment left to her, a black dress long faded but scrubbed clean until the fabric shone at the seams. She tied her hair into a simple knot, every strand pulled tight, her face set with the stern calm of someone who had weathered storms too long to bow to whispers. Beside her walked Jake Ryland. His stride was steady, shoulders broad against the cutting wind. He carried himself as if the street itself might test his resolve, but his eyes stayed soft each time they turned toward her. Between them, Samuel clutched their hands, wearing a boy's shirt borrowed from Mrs. Johansson, its sleeves rolled high over his wrists. The three of them, walking down the road of Cedar Ridge, looked for all the world like a family already, though none had yet dared to speak it aloud. The courthouse loomed ahead, a red brick building with a sharp gable roof, a mark of authority standing above the wooden shops around it. Its doors stood open. Inside, benches of rough pine were already crowded. Men and women leaned forward, eager eyes fixed on the doorway, whispering with the hunger of gossip. A widow was about to stand against Dalton, the town's richest landholder. Margaret stepped through the doors, and at once the hush broke into murmurs. "A woman can't hold land alone. They say she's living with that drifter Cowboy. She'll lose it all today. Just watch." Her stomach twisted, but she drew a deep breath, lifted her chin. The time for bowing had passed. At the bench sat Judge Carlton, a stout man whose spectacles slid low down his nose. His gavel struck the block with a hollow crack. "Court is now in session." Dalton rose at once. His long coat was pressed, his hair slicked back with oil. Pride sat heavy on his face, but his eyes glittered with something harder, triumph not yet claimed. At his side stood two lawyers from the city, sharp suits, pressed files stacked thick in their arms. They looked out of place in Cedar Ridge, but they carried themselves with the confidence of men already paid. "Your Honor," one of them began, his voice thin and sharp as a knife, "we bring evidence that the Sullivan boundary has been misfiled. According to the federal map of 1876, Dalton land extends to Clear Creek, which means the parcel Mrs. Sullivan occupies is not hers at all." Gasps swept the benches. Some townsfolk nodded, murmuring. Others frowned with pity. Margaret stiffened, blood draining from her face. She rose, words breaking free before she could stop them. "That's a lie." Jake's hand was on her shoulder in an instant, pressing gently, steadying her. The lawyer raised a heavy map, the red seals catching the lamplight like blood. He spread it wide, pointing to the bold lines. The symbols of government carried weight. The townsfolk leaned closer, as though truth itself had been unfurled in ink. Then came the witness. Bernard Hicks, a surveyor with a nervous twitch, shuffled to the stand. His voice shook, but he swore under oath that the boundary matched Dalton's claim. Murmurs thickened. Men shook their heads. A woman clucked her tongue in pity. The judge's gaze fell on Margaret. His voice was heavy, as if already braced for the answer. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you have evidence otherwise?" Her throat was dry as dust. The walls seemed to close in. Her mind went blank hollow as the barn she had lost. She thought of Thomas, of nights alone, of every whisper that said she could not hold. The weight of it pressed until her knees trembled. And then a cough, rough, steady, like the clearing of earth before a seed is planted. All heads turned. Henrik Johansson, silver-haired, stooped over his cane, moved slowly down the aisle. His boots scuffed against the boards, but his eyes blazed sharp as any young man's. "I farmed the land next to Sullivan's for over 20 years. With Thomas, I set the stone markers along Clear Creek with my own hands. That line is the true line." The crowd erupted, whispers turning to shouts. Dalton's lawyer sneered. "The word of an old man. Where are these stones now, then? Why have they vanished?" Henrik reached into his worn satchel and drew out a notebook, its leather cover frayed, its corners bent. He lifted it high. "I record everything. The day we set them, the name of the surveyor, even the weather that morning. Stones 3 feet tall set a quarter-mile apart. Last month I walked the line again, only to find them dug out." Another wave of murmurs, sharper now. Heads turned toward Dalton, suspicion rippling like fire catching dry grass. The lawyer slammed his hand against the table. "Baseless, nothing proven. An old man's stories mean nothing." And then from the benches, another voice, rasping, hesitant, but steady enough to carry. "I heard it." Pastor Williams stood. His black coat trembled with his breath, but his eyes met the judge's without flinching. "Last week I overheard Carver bragging. He and another man boasted of digging out the stones. At Dalton's order, the room exploded. People shouted, surged to their feet. Dalton's face turned crimson as he roared, 'That's a damn lie!' The judge's gavel thundered down. The sheriff moved forward, hand resting on his holster, and Dalton, fuming, was forced back into his chair. The smell of sweat and dust mingled, the weight of justice suddenly heavier than gold. Margaret's knees shook, but tears filled her eyes, not of despair, but of release. For once, truth was louder than money. She saw Johansson holding his notebook aloft, the pastor standing tall, and her heart swelled with the knowledge that she was not standing alone. Judge Carlton leaned back, voice booming through the chamber. "Pending investigation, the land remains under Mrs. Sullivan's claim, and the bank is ordered to accept her payment today. This court is adjourned." The gavel's strike cracked like a rifle shot. Margaret stood frozen, then slowly drew the leather pouch from her coat. With hands trembling yet sure, she set it on the table. "Every penny," she said, her voice carrying steady across the room. Murmurs rose again, softer this time. Some clapped, tentative but true. Faces that had whispered against her now looked down in shame. Dalton stormed out, his boots striking the boards like coffin nails. Margaret turned. Jake's hand found hers, strong and certain. His pale eyes shone with pride and relief. Samuel hugged them both at the knees, looking up with wide hope. "We keep our home?" Mama Margaret pressed him close, kissed his hair, and lifted her gaze to Jake. "Yes, we keep it. Together." On the courthouse steps, the winter wind cut sharp, but warmth bloomed in her chest. Jake bent, kissed her before the eyes of the town. His voice was low breath mingling with hers. "No more running." And in that moment, Margaret knew, though enemies lingered, though whispers would not vanish overnight, she had something greater than land. She had her community, she had justice, and she had a man who would stand beside her to the very end. The instant Johansson raised his notebook, the pastor gave his truth, and the judge's gavel fell in her favor. The chamber had cracked open, and justice, rare as rain in drought, rang through Cedar Ridge at last. Part 10. A spring reborn. That spring came like a quiet miracle after the long season of darkness. Snow melted into streams. Clear Creek rushed free, carrying thin sheets of ice away, and spilling over its banks, the water shining like glass beneath the wide blue sky. All around the Sullivan Ranch, the fields bloomed with wildflowers, purple lupine, golden buttercups, soft pink prairie roses. The air was thick with the scent of new grass, damp and fresh, and the breeze carried the song of meadowlarks and the gentle calls of calves to their mothers. It was a music Margaret had almost forgotten. The barn rose again, smaller than the one before, but built strong, its beams still fragrant with new-cut pine. Children from neighboring farms ran in circles around it, helping where they could, their laughter like bells against the timbers. Grown folk laid out tables and chairs in the yard, their chatter blending with the rustle of the spring wind. Margaret stood on the porch in a simple white dress stitched from her mother's wedding gown, smiling as she watched Samuel tying ribbons to the chairs, his little face glowing so bright his eyes seemed to shine like lanterns. From the direction of the barn, Jake appeared. His shirt was clean, his hair neatly combed, and his pale eyes softened in a way she had never seen before. A rare smile curved his lips. And in that moment, Margaret saw it clearly. This was no longer the restless drifter. This was a man who had found his place. The guests gathered on the grass. It was not a grand wedding, only a handful of families who had once offered help when everything seemed lost. Henrik Johansson leaning on his cane, his wife steadying his arm. Mary Patterson with a fresh pie still warm in her hands. Other neighbors bringing simple bouquets of wildflowers to place on the tables. Their gifts were modest, yet the simplicity lent the day a sacred weight. Pastor Williams stood before the rows of wooden chairs, his black robe stirring in the breeze. His voice rolled deep and solemn. "Dearly beloved, we gather here today." Margaret barely heard the words. Her eyes never left Jake standing tall beside her, his warm hand finding hers, giving a gentle squeeze as if to remind her, "We're here, together." Then Samuel stepped forward, more serious than ever before, carrying a small box with 2 plain gold bands inside, sent from Denver, shining like captured sunlight. He offered them with solemn pride to his mother, then turned and looked up at Jake, his eyes bright as spring water. Jake took the ring, his voice low, but resonant, every word falling like an oath carved into the land itself. "I, Jake Ryland, take you, Margaret Sullivan, to be my wife, to stand beside you in drought and in plenty, in storm and in calm, until death do us part." Margaret's lips trembled, but her voice rang clear, stronger than the spring wind. "And I, Margaret Sullivan, take you, Jake Ryland, to be my husband. I promise to build with you a life worthy of the sacrifices we have made to love you with all that I am forever." When the ring slid into place, the gold caught the morning light bright as a promise renewed. Pastor Williams nodded, his voice warmer than usual. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Jake bent his lips, meeting hers to the sound of cheers and clapping hands. Samuel shouted with joy, then wrapped his arms around them both, his small embrace binding them together. Their laughter rang out, and in that moment, there was no past and no shadow, only a family born under a sky washed clean by spring. The wedding feast was simple, but full of delight. Tables draped with white cloth were laden with bread-roasted chicken garden greens and pies baked by neighborly hands. Each guest had brought something small, yet together it was richer than any banquet. A fiddler struck up a lively tune. Children whirled in the grass, their skirts and shirts fluttering, while the grown folk laughed, raised cups, and sang along. Margaret was pulled into the circle of dancing, but her eyes kept searching for Jake. When at last he came to her offering his hand, she placed hers in his without hesitation. They danced in the ring of neighbors, smiling wide their laughter, spilling into the fields and mixing with the music echoing across the land. At the edge of the property, Dalton sat astride his horse watching. His face was unreadable, his posture rigid. He did not enter, nor could he. This time the land was no longer his to threaten. Margaret saw him, but she did not turn away. Instead, she squeezed Jake's hand tighter, a silent declaration: enemies may look on, but they could no longer take what had been won. As the sun set, orange light poured across the wild flowers, painting the whole field in gold. The community lingered together. Samuel perched on Jake's knee, listening wide-eyed as Jake told gentle stories of cattle drives and far-off rivers. Margaret sat close, her head resting on her husband's shoulder, warmth spreading through her chest. Night fell, and the guests drifted home. On the porch of the little cabin, Margaret and Jake stood side by side, gazing out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The spring breeze brushed past them, cool and sweet, carrying the earthy smell of damp soil and the faint song of Clear Creek flowing nearby. Inside, Samuel slept soundly, his breaths even and safe. Jake wrapped his arms around Margaret from behind, his voice brushing her ear. No regrets. She smiled softly, whispering, "None. We've earned this happiness." Above them, the stars glittered like lanterns. In the far distance, thunder murmured gentle, promising rain. Margaret tilted her face upward, breathing deep the scent of earth and blossoms, her eyes brimming with quiet tears. After storms, after fire, after gunfire and shame, the rain was returning at last. And in Jake's arms, she knew that this spring was not only the rebirth of the land, it was the rebirth of her own heart. The spring sun spilled gold across the fields, and wildflowers bent with the wind as though waving to a new beginning. Clear Creek rushed bright against its rocky banks, its waters singing an endless hymn, carrying away the last traces of drought and storm. On the land once left in ruin, new sounds rose, the strike of hammer on wood, the rasp of saw, the laughter of children, echoes of a home reborn. Margaret, Jake, and Samuel worked side by side. Jake raised the fence posts, steady and true. Margaret knelt in the soil, planting the first seeds of a season yet to come. Samuel darted between them, cradling a newborn calf in his arms, his small face glowing with joy. 3 silhouettes against the spring sky, bound not only by the land they had saved, but by the family they had built. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass. The clear voice of the stream mingled with the bright laughter of the boy and the quiet chuckle of the man beside the woman he had chosen. And in that harmony lay a truth, simple and enduring: love and courage will always outlast the storm. Which moment of Margaret and Jake's journey moved you most? Share it in the comments below so we can remember those precious seconds together.